C-H-A-P books. I did not create this. This was invented back in the 1500s. And what they were, they became a source of information for poor people. And they were made out of everything from wrapping paper to newspaper to, you find it, they would print it on a chapbook because it was the advent of a printing press. And of course, that allowed them to make these. And what they were sold for was a penny. A penny. Now, these are brief because in order to be a chapbook, you have to be under 30 pages. And the reason they use these chapbooks, and I tell the story because it's a lot like Bourbon. Bourbon got this book, and I was wondering, we've only sold 3 or 4 of these in Bourbon. Well, the idea is people read them and they give them to the next person, and they keep passing it along until they wear them out, and then they pitch them. So that's what nowadays people have told me it's great to use on an airplane because it's an airplane book, because you get up 30 minutes later, you land, or 45 minutes and you've read your book.
Yes.
So that's the origin of the chapbook. Inexpensive. So that's the concept I used for this. I wanted it to be brief, understandable, and Ralph, like you said, it's easy to understand, and it's very, very common, very simple, and that's the reason we've had what I'd say modest success with this. So that's the story of what we've created. Now, these books are all about Crawford County. These stories are stories from Crawford County. They are historical fiction. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, sometimes you can take a story just so far and you run out of information and you got to make a transition to what is the storyline, how do you keep it interesting. And so we try not to discuss fact or fiction because invariably people say, well, that wasn't true. No, that was the part that was true. And so the more fictitious sometimes it sounds, the more accurate it is. So these books all take place from the early 1800s on. Now, the earliest books that we have would be the River Panther, which you just,
my favorite.
You got. So the River Panther came about because of a discussion I had in Arrow Rock with the director of the state park up there, who asked me a question and said, how many people have you lost this year in the Merrimack River? And I went, how do you know about the Merrimack River? He said, well, it's Osage legend. I said, what legend? He said that the River Panther consumes one soul every year from the river. I said, I wonder if that's true. Well, I researched it back through the St. Louis newspapers, and lo and behold, at least for the last 45 years that I went through, every year, one person at least drowns in the Merrimack River. And the most recent case, we had the coroner called, and he said, would you stop by the office? I said, sure. He said, I got something I don't know what to say about this. He said, I read the book. He said, and I just was part of recovering a body in the river. He said, and we've actually got the film of people sitting there holding hands in a circle, going about with their movie camera, and they went this way, and they came back this way, and the guy was gone. Where'd he go? Well, Dake said, the coroner said, we know where to find bodies in the river, because people, when they drown, go straight down. He said, now, here's my problem. I found this body 20 yards, 15 yards farther up the river. He said, there's no way that can happen. And he said, that really startles me when I read that book. And he said, how's this all go together? And I said, I don't know. It's just one of those situations that was very common to the idea that the Osage Indians had about river panthers and what are they and are they real? So you kind of get into the mythology of the Osage, but you got to remember that the Osage were here a lot longer than we've been here. This was their home. Right where we sit today was a center of Osage living, hunting, and farming. And what the Osage would do is they would plant their crops in the spring, and then they migrate north to hunt buffalo and to replenish their food supply, and then they would come back in the fall and harvest the crops. Now, what I'm surprised about is how in the world did they do that, keeping the bugs off of them and all that, but they did fine, and in their huts, not tents, in their huts like that, they dug a giant hole in the middle of their hut and buried all of their produce, and they lived off of that during the course of the winter. So that's kind of that transition that we go through.
So that was their root cellar.
Yeah, that was I guess, the original root cellar. So,
and what about the river panthers doing the protection of the cairns or the graves? And at a point in the river where the annualized creek, or Possum Hollow in my case, goes into the Merrimack, and right up from there, of course, the river moves every now and then.
Are you near the bluffs?
Uh-huh.
Right, okay. Here is the mythology of the bluff. Under the bluff is an entrance to the cave where all of the gold, money, everything has been stored under the control and protection of the Osage River Panthers. They guard the entrance. And of course, you hear about legacies of old-time robbers and things like that, and what happened to their goods and what happened to the gold, and they were taken by the Osage, and some people buried their stolen loot only to find it dug up by the Osage. And what did the Osage do with it? There's no evidence that they had it, but they buried it.
And they bartered everything with their skins and stuff like that. They didn't buy things with gold.
No, gold. They took gold because it was pretty. There wasn't much about that.
And 1200, was that about when the Osage really established this area? 1200, coming from Illinois and Tennessee.
Well, the migration to this part of the world from the Osage were originally dislocated because of the Iroquois. And they settled, on the opposite shore of St. Louis, hence the building of the Indian mounds. Then the Osage decided to divide up into three groups. They crossed the river. These are the Middle Osage here. Northern Osage, another name became Iowa. That works. and south towards St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, became the group called the Kappaha. Those were the three organizations.
Nations or something.
Yeah, and of course the most powerful would have been this group, but the French referred to the Osage as the people of the Middle River. Okay, and so that's kind of where, and then that group broke into smaller groups, and I could wear us out here for the rest of the day talking about, the cliff people, the flatland people, and those kind of groups, but they were separate. Now, the one thing to remember, as we talk about in the Panther book, is the Osage were the most feared Indians in America. Nobody wanted to mess with the Osage. One reason, they were so tall. They were big. They were massive. And they had a strange sense of humor. And what that was is because they lived in battle and fought, depending on what color the markings were on them, if they had yellow or green, they would attack trappers and stuff like that. But they wouldn't kill them. They wouldn't hurt them because that was a joke paint. It was a funny thing to do, is turn over canoes and beat holes in them and hang on, but they never killed anybody. And now if they had red and black on, you were going to die. But so the colors emulated kind of the condition of how their take was at that time of the year. So, and that's also when you study the river panther, the book you got, you'll see where they original Pahaska, the original Mahaska, who came down and settled the Salvation Army camp south of Bourbon, Camp Mahaska. Okay, he originally met his wife, who was an Osage woman, and was brought together by a guy at a place north of Cuba, and his name was Osage Jake, hence the term Jake's Prairie. Now, what Jake was doing up there all by himself, he apparently was spared the migration out of Missouri in the 1820s and decided to drift off up there, and apparently no one ever bothered him.
Because he was in the middle of nowhere.
He was just surviving in the middle of nowhere. Now, Jake's Prairie is very populated now, and of course has a number of people. But that was the origin of him. And then to finalize that section, you get into the shooting and the murder at that camp, Mahaska, on the 4th of July by 2 or 3 people who got into an argument, and the shooting actually occurred on the fairgrounds. Now, it was a very foggy situation with interpreting what you hear, but I actually met the guy whose uncle was standing next to the guy that shot the sheriff because he had the powder burns on his arms because he was so close to the actual murder. So that's
and that was Crawford County.
Yeah, that was right south of Bourbon. The guy got on his horse. They knew who he was, who killed the sheriff. They chased him, and he disappeared, never to be seen again. So
he had to cross the Merrimack.
Well, that was the interesting thing. When they got to the Merrimack, they got totally covered by fog. And they heard him in front. And then the hoofbeats ended. So they thought, did he get in the river? Did he go into the river? Did he get out of the river? Mystery. He just disappeared. And that's, again, part of, I guess, Osage legends. So, That was the story of the river panther, and it dates back to the late 1700s, early 1800s.
So the 1790s,
Yeah, that's right.
when all the Scottish and stuff came to the southeast. I think my great grandma was from Virginia,
Right.
Scotland.
Well,
And they were developing that area,
right.
who's Shawneetown now.
And here's the interesting thing that we need to focus on. Did Missourians have slaves? Yeah, they did. But not like Gone with the Wind. You know, we didn't have cotton fields and all that. Slavery in Missouri was very individual. So you worked next to your slave every day. So it was like, you know, who's going to go get the water? Who's going to do this? Who's going to do that? And that then begins to blend itself into the book. Some things be worse than dying. And that's the story of Mary, who was the youngest girl ever hung in Missouri. All my research, everything, there are tons of stories out there about this. Most of them came from the St. James area, the Brinker Cabin area, but they weren't true. A lot of witchcraft, a lot of stuff like that. There were stories about how they entrapped little Mary to find out that she was, no, that never happened. She was.
So that was the media of Rolla, Phelps County.
Yeah, and there was barroom talk, socialite talk, church basement talk, and that's where Mary ran into trouble. Was she beaten? To get the answer yes out of her, yes, she was stripped and beaten, and she was terrified. Well, finally they said, if you admit you killed the baby, we'll stop the beating. Well, she said, I did. Okay, fine. And so there's a lot of stories about her, but no evidence. And here was the one big thing that we missed in that whole story. There was, okay, here I'm going to do my lawyer thing. Are you ready? Are you ready? There was no motive. And nowadays, if you go to trial, people want to know why did they. Well, there was no reason why she would have done that.
She was a babysitter kind of thing.
Yeah, she was a nanny or whatever, and apparently had no evidence of any wrongdoing.
And no one saw anything.
No, and
they drowned, right?
Right, the baby got away from her and got to the spring and fell into the spring. And that's how they came up with how Mary killed her. Why?
I lost a 3-year-old from drowning in Old Possum Hollow.
So they hung her. They hung her at the courthouse, and they took her body away north towards Bird's Nest. And the ongoing thing that we get questions about is, where is she buried? I don't know. I mean, they.
And you think the court would have some documents?
Working with court documents is difficult, and here's why it's so difficult. The scribe, whoever took the, come on in, grab a seat. The scribe wrote it in pencil, in cursive, and you have never seen anything until you've seen the writings of these people. I mean, beautiful, but you can't read it. Well, it took us he took the right people to read the documentation. And well, we hit it. On part of that, I hit a total dead end on the book.
And it was left up to the sheriff.
Well,
Or whatever.
it was a situation where the sheriff did his best, but when the crowd showed up to take the prisoner, Pat Wallace, out of jail, they hung him 5 times. That was the style of, that's the stretching you hear about. We didn't call it hanging, it was called stretching. And they stretched him, and they would adequately stretch you until you finally told the truth. Well, they did not get that done, and many of the judges and lawyers at that time pleaded with the crowd to go home, and some of the names that are still lawyers, they're distant relatives, but they were the people that saved Pat Wallace. Well, the next night, it didn't go so well. A couple of weeks later, he was broke out of jail again. So, and that's what led to his hanging at Bird's Nest. Now, I'm confusing 2 stories here because I'm telling you the story of the death of the innocents, which was the death of Malcolm Logan on the railroad tracks at Hobby Hut Road, because they were walking home, and Pat Wallace killed Malcolm Logan on the railroad tracks. Right here. All right? And then, at that time, there was no I-44, so Hobby Hut went straight up that hill. And that's where the Logan cabin has been found. Pat Wallace went in there after money, found out he had a number of incidents prior to that where he was after money. I don't know why he was after money, but he thought that Malcolm Logan had more money in the cabin. So he went up and confronted his wife, Anna, and she told him to get out, and he killed her with a hatchet. And then he proceeded to go into the children's room and killed all 4 of the children. And that's why he was captured and then hung. And I thought that the succinct case there was one of the perpetrators asked him, would you like to say a prayer? And one of the guys in the crowd said, did you give that little lady time to pray? He said, no. And they said, stretching. So that's the history of that. Now, it's purported that the rope that was used to hang Pat Wallace still is in the Crawford County courthouse, and there is a picture of that in the book. So that's the more gruesome. The more playful was the May and Betty book, which I loved. I loved writing the story because Betty Bronner was a real life Bourbonite who was a good friend of May, and Betty couldn't make it locally, so she went to St. Louis to the Missouri Theater that had a hairdressing salon, Lila, right in it. And so she took care of people's hair. And apparently was doing okay, but then one day, a gentleman came in by the name of Sonny Jim Bottomley, who was everything in baseball. He took one look at Betty Bronner and fell in love. So 2 days later, he comes back for another haircut. Well, and here's the story, and I love this because he sits in the chair and he said, "Hi, do you remember me?" And she said, "Sure, I remember you." And he said, "Right, what's my name?" And she said, "Chick Hafey." Well,
That was his real name.
no, that was the guy who hit 326, who played the outfield for the Cardinals. And she knew that would spur him on. And Sonny Jim went nuts. He said, "I'm not Chick Hafey. I am Sonny Jim Bottomley."
What a line.
And so anyway,
Wow.
she gave it up because she started to laugh, and then he felt.
And that's when he was a Cardinal.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, and so everybody, and so she then retorted back, "I know exactly who you are. You started with the Cardinals last August. You're an MVP player. You went to the World Series, blah, blah, blah." And he went, "Boy, I overstepped my..." And then she quotes the statistics for Chick Hafey.
So cool.
And so she knew her baseball. She knew her baseball. Well, so anyway, Sonny Jim says, "I got a great idea. I'm going to give her a free ticket to a Cubs game." Oh. And so he kept looking out of the dugout to see the chair, and she wasn't in it. Well, he gave up. Seventh inning, he glanced, and there she was. Well, the irony is Sonny Jim won that ball game with a 2-run double. They beat the Cubs 3-2, and he looked back up, and she was gone. Sonny Jim leaves Sportsman's Park, sees her get on a streetcar, goes after the street, and he's still got his ball uniform on. And he finally catches her and says, "Would you please go out with me?" And she said yes.
What?
And that was the beginning. And then the incident, she had some bad times in St. Louis because she was from Crawford County. She was from Bourbon, and she knew how people treat each other. And she ran into a couple of women who were associated with the Cardinals who were not necessarily nice women. Back at that time, they were colorful, let's say, and they got into a fight. And of course, Betty won. But she was humiliated, and she left St. Louis, and Sonny Jim, who was still playing ball, followed her to Bourbon and said, "I love you. I want to marry you." And she said, "I'll tell you what, I'll marry you on one condition. We live in Bourbon." And that's why they bought the farm on South N, Highway N, right before you get to the YMCA, that road to the right, that goes up to their home that he built.
You mean the Salvation Army?
Right. Right before you get to that gate, it's this road before that. And that's where he and his wife resided.
Did you find out exactly? I never did look into when he bought that property. Early 30s, probably, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Because that's when he left the Cardinals. And she became quite an agent. He was traded to the Cincinnati Reds, and she got irate because she didn't think they were offering him enough money. But that's a whole different story. So those are the markings of a friendship, and I hope that book turned out well. I enjoyed writing it, and I urge you to get it. So I think those would be the main stories. You will see a common thread. What I do use, I have the same minister throughout all the books, who is kind of the my staunch conviction of how a religious person should act. And I used him quite a bit in the book I just finished, as small as it may be, on General Harney. General Harney. He has a mansion or a large home in Sullivan, which actually is in Crawford County, I might add. That book may not be well received because in my research of General Harney, which I thought was going to be a Dr. Feel-Good book, it did not turn out that way. He was a mean, cruel murderer who killed a young slave girl. They took
Just 1850s or?
Yeah, she met her death in the 50s, and of course he was the fourth highest rated general in the United States.
Wow.
And Francis Blair, Senator Blair, badmouthed him and took issue with some of the ways he treated the militia, because at that time Governor Price was Southern, feds were Northern, and there was nothing but conflict up and down what became I-44.
Yeah. From Jefferson or Barracks on down.
Right. And so you've got to remember, of all of the states that eventually surrendered, all of them, no one ever surrendered in Missouri. Missouri never surrendered, to which led to some interesting times for our people.
Crawford County.
Oh my! And then on top of that, some of our young people began to chafe under control of the federal government, and they began to do things to anything marked federal.
And Jesse James and stuff like that.
Jesse, Frank, Youngers, Quantrell was gone by that time. Bloody Bill Anderson. You got to remember, this was the frontier. This is the home of Wyatt Earp, Annie Oakley. I mean, it's not.
Here, that's right.
Huh?
So they all came through here. Like
Yeah, they were here. And now my favorite story is Wild Bill Hickok. And when I was a little kid raised in Bourbon, the story was Wild Bill Hickok was here all the time. And everybody identified Wild Bill because he was a wagon master on Old 66, which was called the Springfield Road, which was called the Wire Road, which on prehistoric times talks about that path of the mastodons. But that was a reason, and I couldn't come up with the reason. Well, I eventually got my reason. He had a girlfriend in Bourbon, and that's why so much of the work and artwork you see about Wild Bill in Oklahoma, they just recently, 2 years ago, took down a picture and turned it over, and it says made in Rolla, Missouri. So, now he had a brother, and his brother had a unique name. Wasn't Wild. His name was Tame Hickok. And so he was the counterpart to Wild Bill. But this road, the old wire road that runs up through our entire area down to Springfield, was the hallmark of people who were very well-known individuals in Missouri. Came up and down that road from Jefferson Barracks, and that's where it initiated from. And it was 70% of all the goods sold in Missouri actually came up the Osage Trail, if you want to call it that, which is what it was called for hundreds of years, the Osage Trail. So those are some of the stories. That's the most recent story. Yeah.
Did you ever hear a last name for the woman that's from Bourbon that he was involved with?
No. No, I haven't done that.
I'm digging to find that.
I know. I'm afraid if I find that out, I'd have to squelch that.
Evidently, there were a lot of stories about his relationships. My mother is was a Sullivan, or is a Sullivan girl, and she always, all the teenagers knew and wanted him. My father, a Marine, buried next to her, and Bonneville is on the other side.
Right.
And I know he's turning in his grave because she always would tell stories of some of the girls that wanted to be with Bonneville.
He apparently was a ladies' man.
And I know in Bourbon for sure. Yeah.
Oh, Bourbon's for sure. Yeah, and the most recent verification I had on a fun story was I knew that the James boys came through Bourbon quite a bit, and my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, was alive and well and 12 years old when the James boys would ride to town. She was a little girl. I said, well, oh my, how wonderful was that with all riding the horses and their dusters flying? And she said, what? And I said, on the horses. They rode fast. She said, they weren't on any horses. She said, why would you take a horse when you could ride a train? Oh. And they did. That's how the James boys traveled, was on the train. Ha! Boy, that brought a lot of great memories for me.
Wow.
But I said, what was Jesse like? She said, I don't know. He would pay no attention to us. Now, they liked Frank because he bought stick candy, hard candy, and gave it to the little kids. And they thought that. So, and then you get a clustering of stories about this happened, that happened, and you got to be careful about the stories because, wow, some stories just don't hold water. They just fall apart. So that's what I've been up to for 5 years. That's the new release coming out. I wish I could tell you. Well, now I'm down to one book of the River Panther. That's the end of that.
I'm not lending it to anybody.
Yeah, I would urge it definitely.
Never lend.
I got one.
And I know, I gave him one.
Oh, you gave him one?
But his granddaughter, I lent it to her.
No, that was another one.
I just got that back.
That was the second one.
Yeah. Don't lend them out.
Okay.
You have one more river panther over there.
We have what?
One more river panther.
And that's not.
What?
That's
I wasn't
not for
sure
sale.
if you took that one.
Oh, I've got one. Yeah. The Death of the Innocents is gone. May and Betty, we got those, and we've got a few of There's Worse Things Than Dying. I think there's 9 of those.
One question that I have, and well, I always have questions, I guess. You have an Osage blanket, and I think that was given to you through the Osage, and they have a division or something, and it's the River Panther clan or something like that. And is that a River Panther blanket?
Not that I know of. No, that was never mentioned. That was given to me by my good friend Johnny. Oh, Marisa, help me with that. Who was Johnny Williams? He and
Chief of language, or
he was a chief assistant to the chief. He was Standing Bear
yes,
was there, and
I was
yeah.
You were whiffed with that Eastern red cedar.
Oh yeah,
I think it's a weed, and they think it's blessing you.
yeah. You gotta breathe. They do the envelopment of the smoke for you.
You got blessed.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know what that means, but it's great. I'll take any question you have about anything.
What's the name of your latest book?
Devil Dog is what I call it.
Devil Dog?
Because the story begins by this is an actual fact. The servant ran a dog out of the house, threw a frying pan at it, that his father grabbed the dog, tried to stop it, and the dog bit him. Well, 3 weeks later, he died of rabies. And so General Harney corralled the dog. Was he bitten? Was he scratched? Did something happen? Well, he got deathly ill. And when you get rabies, the one thing you desire and want is water, but the one thing you cannot take is water. That's the death of rabies for you. So Harney lived through that. And did that create him to be the kind of individual he was?
An ass.
I don't know. The irony is, he had an epiphany. Something changed when he was 60 years old, and he actually went back to be a representative of the federal government for Indian Affairs out in the West, and became a much renowned, loved general by the Indians, who, as you go through the West, you'll see hills, mountains, rivers called Harney Hill, Harney River, Harney this. So that was his change. Now, what brought about that change? That's a fun thing to talk about. Something happened. Well, get the book.
So he was like a Custer a little bit.
Yeah, meaner and smarter. He developed strategies that they used during Vietnam, and with using riverboats and cutting off. But he was the one who won the Seminole War because he beat them and figured it out, and so that's why he was so acclaimed.
Do you know where he's buried at? Harney?
Yes, Arlington Cemetery.
Where's that?
Arlington,
Arlington?
yeah, Washington, D.C.,
Okay, yeah.
with his wife. His wife was buried with him, and that's a whole new book, just about his younger wife, which the children did not like because they lost their inheritance and money,
Oh, yeah.
and she got everything. So, yeah, that's where he's buried. Yeah. Maurice, have I done enough?
You did great. Thank you. We can have lunch.